They say a woman remembers every moment she was made to feel small. I remember mine clearly, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through sheer curtains, the scent of black coffee turning bitter as it cooled on the kitchen table, and the way my husband's voice curled with polite cruelty when he said I wasn't quite pretty enough for the new company gala. He said it so offhandedly, so matter-of-fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. I had been married to Thomas for 12 years by then. We met when I was 22, freshly graduated with a degree in art history that no one in my family understood. He was already climbing the ranks at a marketing firm, clean-cut, ambitious, with a smile that made people lean closer. I was not the kind of girl men like him usually pursued, or so I believed. I remember the early years with a tenderness that surprises me now. The way he held my hand in elevators, kissed my forehead in front of his friends, whispered that I had a classic look, all words that made me feel chosen, even special. But love, or what I thought was love, has a way of softening your gaze until you can no longer distinguish between warmth and control. When he took the new position, VP of Client Relations, it was as if something in our marriage quietly recalibrated. He began working longer hours, attending more events, surrounding himself with people who wore luxury like armor. One day, he asked me not to post photos of us online because, in his words, his image needed to remain aspirational. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. It was. My presence started to diminish in his world. I was no longer invited to company retreats or launch parties. When I asked why, he explained that appearances mattered and that some of the women at these events looked like they belonged on magazine covers. He said it gently, almost apologetically, but the message was unmistakable. I wasn't the image he wanted to project. I wish I could say I confronted him then, demanded respect, or reevaluated our marriage. But I didn't. I absorbed the humiliation like I had been trained to as a woman, as a wife, as someone who had learned that silence was sometimes the only form of dignity left. Instead, I turned inward. I started painting again, not for galleries or shows, but for myself. Our garage became my sanctuary. I bought second-hand canvases, mixed my own shades, and let my brush speak the things I couldn't. In those moments, I remembered who I was before I became someone's accessory. I began to see the outlines of a woman I had once loved in the mirror, and it stunned me how much I missed her. It was during this quiet return to myself that Thomas's boss, Eleanor Walsh, came into the picture. She had just been appointed CEO and was making waves for her bold strategies and unapologetic presence. I had never met her, though I had seen her in glossy newsletters and heard stories of her unflinching leadership. One day, an embossed envelope arrived at our home, addressed to me. It was an invitation, not to accompany my husband but to attend the annual leadership gala alone. My name, not his, was on the guest list. Thomas was furious when he found out. He claimed it was a clerical error, that someone in admin must have sent it by mistake. But the truth was in the way his voice trembled, in the way he avoided my eyes. He knew, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't seek his permission. I wore a dark green gown I had kept in the back of my closet, one I had bought years ago thinking I'd wear it to something special. It fit snugly but elegantly, like it had been waiting for that exact evening. I did my hair in soft waves, painted a thin line of confidence along my lashes, and walked into that ballroom not as someone's wife but as myself. What happened that night would take time to unpack, but it began with a single sentence Eleanor said to me while holding a glass of champagne and looking me square in the eyes. I wanted to meet the woman behind the man. Now I understand why he's been so nervous. That moment would become the axis on which everything else turned. I have always been told I have a quiet presence, that I enter rooms like a whisper, not a storm, but that night something different shimmered around me. Perhaps it was the gown, or the way the lights caught in the gentle folds of satin, or perhaps it was simply the fact that I had come alone by invitation into a room built to intimidate. People looked, some with curiosity, others with confusion, but I felt neither small nor misplaced. I felt visible. Eleanor greeted me as if she had known me for years. Her handshake was firm but graceful, her gaze unwavering. There was something in her eyes, a kind of knowing, as though she had once been me or someone very much like me. She asked how I spent my time, and I told her quietly that I painted. She tilted her head and said that explained the quiet strength in my posture. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but those words stayed with me. Throughout the evening, I noticed Thomas from afar. He moved between conversations, laughter practiced and gestures polished. But he looked over his shoulder more than once, his gaze occasionally snagging on me with something that resembled unease. He never approached. There were whispers, subtle but unmistakable. I caught fragments, questions about who I was, why I had been invited alone, whether I was an investor, an artist, a philanthropist. Eleanor never clarified. She only introduced me simply as someone I wanted the team to meet. It was enough to leave them wondering, and sometimes the power lies in not explaining. When the speeches began, Eleanor took the stage with calm command. She spoke about vision and courage, about authenticity in leadership. And then, in the middle of her address, she paused. She glanced in my direction, and her next words felt like they were meant only for me. We build companies the way we build relationships. If your foundation is image, you may impress, but you will never connect. If your foundation is respect, you may not dazzle, but you will endure. It wasn't applause that followed, it was silence, thoughtful, heavy silence, the kind that makes people examine their own reflections in the polished glass of ambition. After the event, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The air was crisp, the city lights below like a constellation scattered by human hands. Eleanor joined me. She didn't speak for a while, then she said something that changed me. He forgot that the woman who holds the heart is often the one with the mirror. Some men fear what a woman might reflect back. She wasn't talking about Thomas directly, but she was, and I understood then that she hadn't invited me out of pity or strategy. She had invited me because she saw something worth seeing. That night I walked past Thomas without stopping. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I kept moving. I returned home, hung up the gown, and stood in front of the mirror I used to avoid. I looked at myself not with critique, but with recognition. Not pretty enough, perhaps not for the illusion he was chasing, but for myself, for truth, for art, for strength. I was finally more than enough. In the days that followed the gala, the atmosphere in our home thickened with unspoken things. Thomas avoided mentioning the event altogether. He came home later than usual, his presence growing more spectral by the evening. I did not press. I let the silence bloom between us like an unwelcome vine, curling over the remnants of our marriage. I spent my days in the garage studio, painting with a fervor I hadn't felt in years. What began as color studies became sprawling portraits of women with unblinking eyes and unapologetic expressions, of abstract shapes that resembled doors opening and closing. The act of creation became a form of translation, a language that let me say what I never dared speak aloud. I found myself reflecting more on the woman I used to be, the one who smiled too quickly when dismissed, who flinched when her worth was questioned, who apologized for occupying space. She had been kind, she had been tender, but she had been too quiet for too long. Eleanor's words stayed with me. They echoed not as praise but as permission. Permission to be seen, to take up space, to reimagine what it meant to be a woman unshackled from a man's approval. One morning, I received an unexpected call from the gallery downtown, the same one I used to visit when I was still a student, gazing at canvases with both envy and longing. A woman named Clara had seen some of my work online, apparently shared by a friend I had nearly forgotten I'd given a painting to. She wanted to feature 3 of my pieces in an upcoming showcase titled Women Becoming. My breath caught in my throat, not from disbelief, but from the weight of a truth that had quietly ripened inside me. I no longer needed to be validated to feel real. But the offer still mattered, not because it elevated me, but because it mirrored back the life I had reclaimed. When I told Thomas about the exhibition, his expression barely shifted. He mumbled something resembling congratulations, eyes still glued to his phone. I watched him for a moment, not with anger, but with distance. I could no longer feel the pull that had once tethered me to his approval. We had become parallel lines, close but never touching, drawn in separate directions. He had chosen a life of impressions. I had chosen something harder, truth. In the weeks leading up to the show, I worked until midnight, canvases leaning against the garage walls like silent companions. I poured myself into every stroke. The night before the opening, I stood in the middle of the studio surrounded by the raw evidence of my transformation, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not loud, not triumphant, but deeply rooted. That evening, I slipped into a simple black dress and soft heels. No gown this time, no attempt to dazzle. I didn't need to. When I arrived at the gallery, Eleanor was already there. She greeted me not as a guest, but as an equal. She told me she had purchased one of my pieces anonymously, one of the early ones, a painting of a woman standing alone in the rain. She said it reminded her of herself. I thanked her quietly, not for the money, but for seeing me when I couldn't. Thomas showed up late, alone. He hovered near the back, hands in his pockets, unsure of where to stand. Our eyes met briefly, and in that flicker I saw it, the dawning realization that I no longer needed him, not for identity, not for worth, not even for closure. He walked away before the speeches began. And I stayed, centered in a room filled with light and walls bearing the truths I had painted into being. There's a stillness that comes after revelation, not the dramatic kind, but the slow-burning clarity that seeps into the bones. In the weeks following the gallery show, that stillness wrapped itself around my life. I began to move through my days with a different rhythm, a quiet confidence that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The house was the same, but I was not, and that made all the difference. Thomas and I occupied the same space like ghosts who had forgotten why they haunted the same corridors. He still poured his coffee in the morning, checked his emails with intensity, ironed his shirts with precision. But there was an edge to him now, an absence of control where once he had felt secure. He avoided eye contact more often. His phone calls took place behind closed doors. I noticed the way he stiffened when the doorbell rang, or when my phone lit up with a name he didn't recognize. I, on the other hand, had learned the value of solitude. Not the kind shaped by rejection, but the kind I chose for myself. I began walking in the early mornings just as the sun stretched over rooftops. I would stop by the bakery near the park, buy a croissant still warm from the oven, and sit beneath the elm tree with my sketchbook. These small rituals, mundane to most, became anchors in a life that once revolved entirely around another's orbit. The exhibition had come and gone, but the ripples remained. Clara invited me to speak at a small gathering of local artists. I hesitated at first. Public speaking was never my strength. But then I remembered the woman in the rain, the one Alina saw in my painting. I owed her a voice, so I said yes. The evening of the gathering, I stood in a room filled with strangers who leaned forward as I spoke, not about technique or galleries or success, but about silence. About the kind of silence that hollows a person out from the inside and the courage it takes to reclaim your voice. I didn't mention Thomas by name, I didn't need to. Every woman in that room knew a version of him, and every woman in some way had been a version of me. Afterward, a young girl approached me, barely 20, wide-eyed and trembling. She told me she had left her fiancé that morning. That something I said had been the final push she needed. I hugged her, held her longer than I expected, and whispered what I wished someone had said to me years ago, that her life was still hers to shape. When I returned home that night, the lights in the living room were off. Thomas had left a note on the counter. It was brief, distant, typed. He had moved out. There was no explanation, no confrontation, just absence. For a moment I stood there, staring at the note like it might rearrange itself into something softer. But it didn't, and I didn't cry. Instead, I turned on the lamp beside the window, picked up my brush, and began a new canvas. Not out of heartbreak, not even out of release, but out of continuation, because healing is not a moment. It is a series of choices, to show up, to speak, to see. I painted until the sky outside turned silver with dawn. And in the quiet light of morning, I realized I had already let go long before he left. After Thomas left, the quiet became fuller, not emptier. It didn't echo, it held me. The absence he left behind wasn't a void, it was space. And I filled that space slowly, not with noise, but with presence, my own. The routines continued, but they deepened. The morning walks became longer. I learned the names of the bakery workers. I started bringing my sketchpad not only to draw, but to write scraps of thoughts, fragments of memory, reflections that had waited years to be heard. It was as though my voice had roots now, and they were beginning to stretch into the soil of who I truly was. The gallery invited me back for a solo exhibit. The theme was mine to choose. I called it Refractions. It wasn't about revenge, nor even redemption. It was about truth refracted through years of distortion, now finding clarity again. I worked for months. Each canvas a reckoning, each stroke a reclamation. I painted late into the night, music low, the air smelling faintly of turpentine and lavender. Some nights I would find myself thinking of Thomas, not with longing but with curiosity. I wondered what story he told himself now. Whether he saw me as the woman who had changed or as the wife who had disappeared from his narrative. But the thoughts didn't sting. They passed through me like wind over a lake, momentarily rippling, never piercing. Elena remained a quiet presence in my life. We exchanged brief messages now and then, words that carried weight even in their brevity. She sent me a card the week before the show, no signature, only a quote, "Art is the highest form of hope." I pinned it on my studio wall. The night of the exhibit arrived with a soft rain that made the streets shimmer. People came, friends, strangers, women who had read a small interview I gave in the local paper. They wandered through the room in silence, stopping often, sometimes wiping their eyes. One woman stood in front of a canvas titled The Vanishing Point for nearly 20 minutes. She left a note beside it. "Thank you for painting what I haven't found words for." It wasn't success I felt that evening. It was alignment. The outer world now mirrored the life I had been building inwardly. And when I spoke, briefly, softly, I didn't shake. I spoke of transformation, not escape. Of rebuilding, not replacing. Of standing in the ashes of who you once were and choosing, brick by brick, to begin again. I returned home that night to a space that now felt entirely mine. I made tea, sat by the window, and opened a letter that had arrived earlier that day. It was from Thomas. The handwriting surprised me. It was careful, almost unfamiliar in its sincerity. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask to come back. Instead, he wrote about what he had realized, how he had confused achievement with value, image with truth. He wrote that seeing me at the gala, seeing me at the gallery, had forced him to look in a mirror he had avoided for years. He thanked me not for loving him, not for staying, but for finally leaving the version of myself that had made his illusions possible. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not to be read again, but not to be discarded. It was a record, a testament to a life lived, a part of the journey I had outgrown but still honored. And then I picked up my pen and began to write, not a journal entry, not a memory, but the first words of something larger. Something that might become a book. A story of a woman who believed she had to shrink herself to be worthy and who one day remembered she was born whole. It's strange how life, when stripped of noise, reveals its most honest shapes. In the weeks after that letter, I found myself dwelling less on what had been broken and more on what I had built. The sorrow no longer lived in my body like it once had. It became a distant relative, acknowledged but no longer invited in. The book took form slowly. I wrote in the same space where I painted, letting the smells of oil and paper blend as if the two crafts were speaking to each other. I didn't write about Thomas, not directly, but I wrote about silencing and awakening, about invisible cages and the quiet triumph of stepping through their bars. I wrote about mirrors, both literal and metaphorical, and how sometimes you don't need them to see yourself clearly. Sometimes you need only to be still. A local women's collective asked if I would host a small retreat. They had read my interview, seen the gallery work, heard about the whispers I had once swallowed and now set free. I agreed, unsure of what I had to offer, but certain that listening itself was a kind of offering. We met in a rented farmhouse outside the city, 12 women, each carrying invisible weight. We sat in circles. We shared without needing to solve. We painted, we wrote, we walked barefoot in fields damp with morning dew. One night, under a canopy of stars, someone asked me when I knew I was no longer broken. I paused, then said, when I stopped waiting to be rescued. They didn't applaud, they didn't speak, they just understood. When I returned home, the house felt different again. Not because it had changed, but because I had brought pieces of those women back with me, their courage, their grief, their resilience. I hung a photograph we had taken together in the hallway, a new mirror of sorts, not for my reflection, but for the community that now surrounded me in spirit. One afternoon, I received a call from Elena. She was retiring, she said, moving to the coast to begin writing her own memoir. She laughed gently, saying she finally felt ready to tell her story not as a leader but as a woman. She invited me to visit sometime. No agenda. Just two women who had once met across a crowded room, each unknowingly reminding the other that stillness can be strength. I took her up on it. We sat on her porch, waves brushing the shore like breath. She poured tea. We spoke very little. We didn't need to. That too was a kind of knowing. When I returned, I placed a single photograph from that day into a frame. Not a gilded one, just wood, light, clean, simple. I set it beside my writing desk, not as a memory, but as proof. That we survive, that we begin again, that being seen is not the final chapter but the first page of becoming. The story I wrote was published the following spring. It did not become a bestseller, but it reached people. I received letters. I met women in bookstores who whispered, "Thank you," like a secret shared. One of them told me with tears lining her voice that she had left a life that asked her to be small. And that was enough. These days I still paint, I still write, I still walk. And when I pass a mirror I no longer look away. Not because I think I'm beautiful in a way the world chases, but because I know I am whole. Thomas became a chapter, not a villain, not a warning, just a part of the road I once walked. But I became the author.